First of all, I'd like to invite the Speaker of the Assembly to come up and give a short address. Once again, we're very grateful for Alex and his office this year for taking up the opportunity to provide the Commission with support. It's an annual event we look forward to every year. So I think, Alex? Over to you, Alex. Over to you.
Sorry about that, folks. Very sorry indeed. First of all, I do want to formally welcome everybody here today to the launch of the Human Rights Annual Report, Annual Statement, here in Parliament Buildings. The event has become something of a standing fixture in the Christmas calendar for both the Human Rights Commission and the Speaker's Office itself. I do want to place on record my appreciation to Alyson, to David and everyone else at the Human Rights Commission for continuing to hold the launch in Parliament Buildings. It's a very important event, as you know, and I believe it's a fitting and appropriate venue for the statement to be launched here annually. I would also like to welcome in particular Special Rapporteur Mary Lawlor, who will be giving the keynote address this afternoon. It's quite a coup actually to have someone of Mary standing here at the event, and I'm sure that we're all looking very forward to hearing from her shortly. And even from the last few minutes I had with Mary a while ago there this morning, we covered a range of issues, not only domestically but also internationally, of which Mary probably will address later on. So I have to admit that when I stood here last year as a speaker in December 22, that I had expected, if not hoped, that I wouldn't be me to be standing in this podium this year to welcome me once again in December 2023. But obviously some of the themes that I touched on last year do remain pertinent today. The in-tray awaiting any new Assembly and Executive continues to grow, whether it's the cost of living, employment, social security or the pressures on the health service. There is a significant human rights dimension to all of them, not to mention what's happening currently across the world and the international community, with some of which are shameful images that we're watching on a day-to-day basis. Of course, that serves to make a case for a strong relationship between this Assembly and the Human Rights Commission. As we approach a new year, I continue to hope to see the institutions restored here as soon as possible, and unfortunately today, apart from all of yourselves, the faithful, we are in a wee bit of an echo chamber as the focus of attention is elsewhere today, but hopefully that type of process brings us forward to functioning Assembly and Executive. So, and that being the case, then that would obviously allow the parties and the members to get on with tackling all of these issues for the betterment of all of our citizens, including looking at the international scene as well. Because I think that we all must, in this Assembly, must eventually have positions on all of these matters, which are so important to all of our citizens, whatever their views are on these issues. I can also use today as an opportunity to look back on 2023, and this has been something of a landmark year, not least that it marked the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Here at the Assembly, we were able to hold a Good Friday event on Good Friday itself to mark the occasion. The ceremony then not only recognised the contribution made by so many in 1998, but also looked forward to the future with members of our newly formed Youth Assembly playing a central role, and we thought that was a very good opportunity to showcase our Youth Assembly. During the early part of the year, we also had some very high-profile figures join us for the anniversary and to mark that. These visitors included current and former Prime Ministers, and Taoiseach as well, and of course President Joe Biden, and many, many others from around the international community. And that obviously continues to remind ourselves that we need reminding of the goodwill and the international support that exists and existed for the Good Friday Agreement, and ultimately the institutions that were set up as part of that agreement. So we did put a focus of attention on the potential of the Good Friday Agreement, a lot of which has been, I won't use the word squandered, but certainly has been, we're outstanding 25 years. So we must also remember the central role that the Human Rights Commission and human rights itself as a concept and as an idea and as a very important area of work played in the Good Friday Agreement, including setting the foundations for the Human Rights Commission itself. Before I conclude my remarks today, I wanted to talk briefly about an issue that is very much a priority for us, not least the Assembly and the Human Rights Commission itself, and that issue is gender-based violence against women and girls. This has dominated the news cycle throughout the year once again, sadly, and it is important that we keep it high on everyone's agenda. I had the unenviable task of hosting a vigil with the McNally family here in Parliament Buildings as far back as January, following the horrific murder of Natalie. And more recently, I welcomed Women's Aid to the building for an event with young people who have been impacted by domestic violence. The Human Rights Commission have more than played their part in tackling this, of course, and I know that only recently you did launch a podcast to mark International Day of Violence Against Women. It is imperative that we keep these conversations going and getting the message out there. It is my belief that a restored Assembly and Executive will play and can play, and indeed must play, a pivotal role in ensuring all departments and agencies are in the best possible position to tackle these issues that some of which I have mentioned, and you'll hear more about when we get the report from the Commission itself and from Mary's thoughts. In closing then, folks, I want to thank you once again for the invitation to join us today, and I do wish us a very, very successful event. I know that some of the great work that goes on, often behind the scenes and under the radar, but obviously the Human Rights Commission itself deserves our commendation and continuing support for the crucial work that they do about trying to highlight where people's rights are not being protected or not delivered, and finding and shaping ways where we force those, if we need to force or coerce or convince those people who have responsibilities for the delivery of human and civil rights, that they are actually delivered and given to the people who need them. So I want to thank the Human Rights Commission for all their work. I want to thank all of you for showing your great support here today. And we're looking around the hall, see quite a few faces here that have been very active on these matters for quite a long time. So keep that up, and thank you all very, very much, and good luck for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your hospitality and continuing support of the Commission. We wouldn't have it any other place. I think this is where it should be, and this is where it will continue to be for as long as the Human Rights Commission can choose its venue. It's a great privilege to be here and a real pleasure, launching another annual statement. It's particularly pleasing because this year marks 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as Alex says, 25 years of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And as an institution, we remain anchored by both. Both operate so as to value and protect the dignity of all people by the simple fact of their equal humanity. It makes plain, both of these agreements, that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and we continue to see that around the world. The Universal Declaration went on to inspire over 70 human rights treaties, which have been ratified by hundreds of nations. The United Kingdom and Ireland have signed up to almost all of those subsequent treaties, and they did it meaningfully, willingly, and democratically. The Universal Declaration opens with, and I quote, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as a foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." It goes on, "All people are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of the law." And I would say, importantly, it doesn't say citizens, it doesn't depend on status, it just applies to people. And this was very deliberate. The Declaration and everything that followed was informed by survivors of and witnesses to the awful indignity of unequal treatment of people. After the Universal Declaration, there was the European Convention on Human Rights. We hear a lot about it this week in the news. But let me remind you of what that convention actually is and what it does. It contains a number of basic rights which, it was believed by those who drafted it and those who signed it, any civilized society would take for granted. You might say it's the bare minimum, reflecting the breadth of cultures and societies in the Council of Europe. It takes into account that nations have different traditions, so it tends to lag behind a little, waiting for others to catch up. But they do catch up, and so does the Convention. At the Commission, we take account of all international standards, but we recognise, obviously, that the impact of those that are not incorporated into domestic law and therefore cannot be enforced directly in our local courts is greatly reduced. We continue, therefore, to recommend that those treaties that have been ratified are put into practice by direct incorporation. If we aspire to be a forward-looking place that really does value human rights, then we should move beyond the bare minimum. So back to Northern Ireland. When the peace talks were happening here, I remember worrying that we were too small a nation to pull this off, certainly by ourselves. I wasn't sure there was a firm enough foundation to secure lasting peace. But what was so clever, as I watched on, at least in my view, was that the Good Friday Agreement looked back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention to secure the future. So it's both backward and forward-looking. It meant Northern Ireland would be protected by something bigger than ourselves. We were to have something that could protect each one of us, regardless of our immutable characteristics, including race, nationality, politics, gender, sexual orientation, physical, mental ability, etc. Those drafting the agreement knew that this was only going to protect us if it could be used against the very state that made the laws. Human rights violations were at the heart of much of the conflict. No one escaped entirely. Human rights and equality sat at the heart of and were central to the peace process and were then reflected in the text of the agreement. And the parties affirmed their commitment to this. Their commitment was to, and I quote, the mutual respect, the civil rights and religious liberties of everyone in the community, including the right to equality of opportunity and all social and economic activity regardless of ethnicity. And it was, and I go on, a fresh start in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance, mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of the human rights of all. The Northern Ireland Act, the 1998 Act, then brought that agreement essentially into force. And in the Act itself, the Act of Parliament, it describes itself as an act to make new provision for the Government of Northern Ireland for the purpose of implementing the agreement. The agreement, as with the Convention, did not confine itself to citizens deliberately. It refers simply to people, all people who happen to be here. And that was replicated in the protocol, now the Windsor Framework. And that's been reinforced recently when it was accepted that the relevant part of the Belfast Agreement included asylum seekers and refugees. One of the promises made in the agreement was full incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law with direct access to the courts, not partial incorporation, not incorporation of those bits which suit in certain circumstances, and not an opt-out when things got a little bit more tricky. And that incorporation was achieved largely by the Human Rights Act 1998, and simultaneously our membership of the European Union, increasingly enshrined in laws touching on everything from personal data to holiday pay. So when, as we developed, EU law and convention standards were enmeshed and supportive of each other, so the two things developed together and often intertwined. As a result of leaving the EU and the subsequent disengagement from EU law, there was bound to be a direct impact on the enjoyment of human rights and equality in Northern Ireland, and so we found. But that was recognised, this almost certain diminution in rights protection if something wasn't done about it. So a commitment was made to safeguarding human rights and equality protections in the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. The commitment to no diminution of rights and keeping pace with the main equality directives survived also negotiations leading to the Windsor Framework. And why, you might ask myself, lots of people do, in the midst of what was mostly about trade. Why was this so important? Is it important? Well, it is important because a strict adherence to human rights and equality is, as well as being manifestly the right and moral thing to attach a society to, is the single most effective means of ensuring societal well-being and for development of the economy. You don't have one without the other, in our view. Belfast Agreement created us, and the reason it created a Human Rights Commission, over and above what was there before, was because human rights had to be monitored. If they're going to be effective, you have to know that they're being applied. And they knew, and there's lots of discussion, it's interesting going back actually reading again, a strong, independent, expert institution, courageous enough to advise government if it was wrong and to challenge it through the courts in the event of a failure to adhere to human rights law. So that's what was anticipated when the Human Rights Commission was set up. and this is what my taxi driver actually said to me. He was asking me what I was doing today, and he just said, "That's a tightener." Of course, what he meant was the Human Rights Commission can cause a lot of mischief, but that is not what we do. We do not cause mischief. We secure rights for everybody, as we were set up to do. One of our functions is to keep under review the adequacy and effectiveness of law and practice relating to the protection of human rights in Northern Ireland, and to do that we give advice, we make submissions, we give evidence right to the heart of government, and that's why it's so pleasing to be here today. We give evidence to parliamentary committees and hopefully again very soon to assembly committees. One of the powers we have is to investigate. We exercise that power this year in respect of relationships and sexuality education in post-primary schools, and I would commend that report to you for reading. We also, however, and I think this is almost as important as everything else we do, if not more so, we must promote understanding and awareness of the importance of human rights, and that's not neutral. Some people call it education, but it's not just education. We don't simply educate the public on what the Convention says, but we are here to promote the importance of rights as laid down and as vindicated across the Council of Europe. They must be practical and effective, and that's where our legal work comes in, providing advice through the law clinic, supporting litigation, bringing proceedings in its own name, etc. All of that is terribly important, and we've been very active on that front. Our own motion judicial challenge of the Illegal Migration Act is before the High Court at the moment. It's due to be heard on the 28th and 29th of January. We also intervened in a judicial challenge to in shorthand, the Troubles Legacy Act, and that was heard in the High Court in Belfast. We're now waiting for judgment. And at that stage, I want to just go back or to remark maybe on what I hinted at earlier. Challenging government's use of power, even through legislation, so even through what looks like the exercise of democratic will, is precisely what democracy underpinned by human rights requires us to do. This is not anti-democratic, as sometimes suggested. Democracy is not the will of the greatest number. It values everyone equally, even when, particularly maybe, when the majority does not. The right to litigate is essential, it seems to me, to bringing human rights guarantees to life. They're meaningless if not enforced. And when the Commission was set up and provided for, this outcome, taking the government to court, was exactly what was intended. So much so that when there was an issue over the extent of our ability to bring a case in our own name, the legislation was amended to permit us to do so. We were to be a check on government, and that's to their credit that they signed up to that. Without legal, structural, financial independence, it would be impossible for us to do this work. If not truly independent, then we're really nothing. I haven't mentioned directly, because time is short, the other work in this report. It's not because it's less important or it's not as eye-catching, but because I just couldn't do justice to it. There's been a plethora of work going on through the year and recommendations made in relation to legal policy, etc. I would really encourage you to read the report. I know it's quite long, but I can say this because I didn't write it personally. It is a terrific piece of work. It's uniquely comprehensive, thoughtful and expert in its analysis of what has been done and what needs to be done, more importantly even in Northern Ireland this year. If we are to live up to our reputation, and I've travelled a lot in this job now, and I know Mary has, and I suspect she's going to say something similar, we have a reputation as a small place that is admired by much larger places because of our human rights framework and the peace agreement. Not despite it. There are so many people here, and I look out and I see lots of friendly faces, and I also see faces I haven't seen before, which is wonderful, because we really welcome your observations and your comments, critical or supportive. We need to work with you. We want to work with you. And please do contact us however you wish to do that, either today or by email or phoning us up or just stopping me in the street. I can't offer to stop anybody else in the street. It would be inappropriate. This should be, and I think it is, a mutually fulfilling process. We don't want to just identify issues for priority treatment, although we do have to do that. We can't just respond to a groundswell of public opinion or priorities chosen by social media, as tempting as that might be. That certainly would not honour the universality of human rights or our statutory functions. So we do depend on you but we also have to keep looking for those issues and those people who maybe aren't identified or don't identify themselves. That's our job. That can pitch us against government. It can mean we're unpopular at times, but that's also what we're here for, to carry on regardless. The first article of the Universal Declaration notes that people are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Non-gendered sense of the word, I'll suggest, brotherhood and sisterhood. But that can fail, that can let us down, and around the world that is letting us down. So the law is required, it must embrace and protect this notion of brotherhood and sisterhood. But it can only do that if it's applied to every person equally. Citizen, non-citizen, employed, unemployed, homeowner, rough sleeper, law enforcer, law breaker. The law only does any of that if it guarantees the rights in a practical and effective way to the people who are supposed to enjoy those rights. And it only does that if the power of rights is actually held by and owned by the people who can enforce them. And they must be capable of being used against those who hold all of the power. The Convention is not an a la carte menu. It's meaningless if partial, cannot be disapplied when convenient or in respect of those deemed to be less worthy. If that is the sort of human rights protection we have, then we have very little. So any argument based upon convenience and disapplying the Convention, I would really urge people to think very seriously. It can be hard to recover something that's thrown away. If you are deserving today, you might not be tomorrow, and then what? Then what do you turn to? I do fear that we've moved away from the Universal Declaration, from the Convention and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and I fear we've moved away both figuratively and literally. But before we contemplate breaking those ties completely, remember what we dedicated ourselves to here 25 years ago. We don't need another fresh start. We had one that was perfectly good. It was admired across the world, and it secured so much for us. Let's go back to what was said then, but actually deliver it this time. Let the institutions do their job that they were set up to do democratically, the protection and vindication of the human rights of all. So I'm going to end there and move quickly. I hope I haven't taken up too much time. My great honour to introduce Mary Lawlor to give a keynote address. Mary is currently an adjunct professor of business and human rights in the Centre for Social Innovation at Trinity College. And by the way, she's so much more than any of this, but I have to keep this short. She's on the advisory board at the Centre for Ethics and Public Life, School of Philosophy, University College Dublin. She has long served human rights through the Irish section of Amnesty International as director, board member and chair. She's been working extensively with and on the situation of human rights defenders across the world, and she's going to talk to us a little about that. In 2001, she founded Frontline Defenders, the International Foundation for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, and that was to concentrate on human rights defenders at risk. In 2020, she became the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And if I could just say, without human rights defenders, we have no human rights worth speaking about. And Mary Lawlor is, in my view, the human rights defender in chief, and we are absolutely delighted to have her here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Alyson, for your comprehensive report, which I look forward to reading page by page, if I get one. So it's great to be here, everyone, and thank you very much to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission for inviting me. It's a great week for me because it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's also the 25th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and the Good Friday Peace Agreement. So for me, it's extra special because yesterday I was in Paris speaking in the Palais de Chaillot, where the Universal Declaration was signed, and where 25 years ago I was also there for the Human Rights Defenders Summit, where the word came through that the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders had passed unanimously at the UN, and the place erupted with joy. And everyone started just going, the people united will never be defeated. And it was great for me to be back there yesterday. So my job as Special Rapporteur is to try and protect human rights defenders at risk around the world. And human rights defenders are people who work peacefully for the rights of others, according to the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration and other international standards like environmental standards and things like that. And to me, they're the people who breathe life into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we're seeing now at the moment how international standards and law are being severely tested. And of course, we can't fool ourselves about the protections that they're providing or what by themselves these documents can do. Part of my role as Special Rapporteur is to address the United Nations twice a year. And twice a year since I took up this post 3.5 years ago, I have reminded states that without the political will to protect human rights and those defending them, these treaties and standards aren't worth much. And my problem is states are always driven by their political interests. They dump on their enemies and they go easy on their friends, and they don't apply a consistent human rights-based approach to their decision-making. I don't need to tell you all about the necessity of positive political will to make good things happen here. I also want to say that despite everything, human rights defenders all over the world have achieved extraordinary successes. Earlier this year, I presented a report to the Human Rights Council, and it was a lovely report because I was just talking about the successes of human rights defenders in the last 25 years since the Declaration was adopted. So nice, you know, instead of all the usual misery that I have to report on. And we had so many examples, you know, of the decriminalization of homosexuality, and equal marriage coming in so many countries, and also a children's organisation in Bangladesh working with a local commissioner, you know, stopping child marriage, and they'd managed to stop dozens of child marriages. And then I could go on all day, but there's 20 pages of them. So if you want to read it, it's on my website. But it's an uplifting report, which is nice. Because you see, human rights defenders have changed laws. They've secured the release of people from prison and from enforced disappearances, as in Yemen, where the abductee mothers are reuniting, first of all, finding people and reuniting them with their families if they're still alive, but at least giving them graves or knowledge so that they know that they can mourn properly. They've also provided humanitarian aid and exposed corruption. For some human rights defenders, just continuing their work under immense pressure in itself is an achievement. And this is nowhere more true than in Gaza, where heroic individuals are continuing to treat the injured and document the awful impact of Israeli bombs on civilians. And here I'm talking about the 135 UNRWA staff who have been killed, the 50-plus journalists and human rights defenders who've been killed for documenting, the doctors who are heroic in trying to keep some form of medical care going, and the other doctors who went in to relieve them when they were exhausted. I call them all human rights defenders. And then the NGOs like the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, or Al Meban, who are trying to document the atrocities that are happening in order to hopefully bring some form of justice in the future. As you know too well here, achieving positive change rarely happens overnight. and it is often the result of long struggles by human rights defenders and their allies, requiring perseverance and the help of networks and other allies in a collective effort, and governments need to play their part. I've heard directly from thousands of human rights defenders since I took up this mandate, and a common complaint is that states ignore the contribution they're making to society. 25 years on from the declaration, defenders are right to expect more support and protection than they currently receive. I'm just back from Algeria, where although there have been some positive reforms since the massive peaceful revolution demonstrations, the NIHRC, in 2019 and 2020 led to a change in government, human rights defenders working on sensitive issues continue to be targeted, and it's the same all over the world. It's the defenders who are working on sensitive issues that nobody else wants to touch, like defending the rights of refugees, migrants and asylum seekers, defending the right to criticise the government's unjust policies, those kind of things, that the rights of the poor, the rights of minorities, women's rights, LGBTI rights, all those kind of rights are the ones that you find most sensitive around the world. And while I was there, I got to visit 3 prisons. I met a man who was jailed for exposing cocaine smuggling. I met a woman sentenced for promoting cultural and linguistic rights of an ethnic group, and another man in pre-trial detention for criticising the government for human rights violations. And that was all done under these vague laws like anti-terrorism or against national unity, the kind of laws that are used as a tactic all over the world to sweep up human rights defenders and try and silence them from doing their work because they are seen as too powerful in some ways. Next year I go to Brazil and Cameroon, and we'll see what that brings. But protecting human rights defenders isn't just something for governments in faraway places. Last year, I joined with other special rapporteurs to formally raise with the British government the issue of the smear campaign against human rights lawyer Colin Harvey, one of your previous commissioners. Many of you know that since 2019, Colin has been the subject of a vicious online campaign in connection with his work as Professor of Human Rights Law in Queen's University, and his personal security has also been threatened. I've also taken up the cases of human rights defenders who are working against the activities of the Canadian mining firm Dalready in the Sperrin Mountains. And I'm continuing to follow that case because when it gets to companies, they have all the power, and the local community opposing this mining have no power. In my report to the Human Rights Council in 21, I detailed how hundreds of human rights defenders are killed every year. We know over 400 are killed every year in defence of things like land, environment, and Indigenous rights. And many of these attacks are preceded by smears and vilification on social media. And then the smearing moves from online to offline and sets the people up to be attacked. And then sometimes they're killed. Not always, but sometimes. Many defenders have shown me death threats made against them, often in public. And many women are attacked and with gendered threats and targeted because of who they are as well as what they do. And a key driver to all these killings is impunity. UN member states repeatedly fail to properly prosecute perpetrators, so impunity persists and the attacks and the murders continue. Ignoring or underplaying the vital contribution of human rights defenders increases the risk to them and their work. And this anniversary year should be one of celebration and recognition of the successes of defenders, and one of not just recommitting to help them, but showing in practical terms what that help should be. And it's not just states that have the responsibility to protect human rights defenders. One of my priorities has been, as I just said a minute ago, in connection with, is business and human rights, because most of the killings are happening in connection with business and human rights. And most of the information I receive point to a roundly negative impact of business practice on the right to defend human rights, especially when it comes to large-scale projects and their impact on communities. And business are supposed to get free, prior and informed consent according to the UN Declaration, the guiding principles on business and human rights. But so often they don't. And while some businesses are trying to build respect for human rights, few are directly engaging with the people who stand to be negatively affected by company operations. And the reality is that most companies are just paying lip service to human rights, if anything. And most governments are not willing to regulate or to address the power imbalances at play. Yet people all over the world do not stand by when they see their lives upended by the arrival of damaging projects into their communities, and they get organised and they insist on their rights. Sometimes they are listened to by the state, if not the company, but often they go ignored by both. And when they refuse to be silent, turning to peaceful protest or to the courts, the backlash starts, leading to intimidation, lawsuits, slap suits, these kind of strategic lawsuits taken against human rights defenders to tie them up in time and money so that they can't continue their work, physical attacks and even killings. And the kind of industries we see where this happens are agribusiness, mining, energy production and tourism develop. Are the industries where retaliation against human rights defenders has historically been the highest. And while the projects may have local operators, often they are ultimately controlled by parent companies with headquarters in the world's wealthiest countries like the US and Canada, the EU, the UK, Australia, and increasingly China. From what I've heard about Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland has been very progressive when it comes to business and human rights. And I'd be interested to hear more about what you've done on procurement, and because it's something we're trying to get the Irish government at the moment in their next National Action Plan to really highlight the role of human rights defenders and the protection of human rights defenders as part of their National Action Plan on business and human rights. And also there's an EU directive coming out next year, which won't obviously apply here, but it will help the protection of human rights defenders because it's going to include a lot of information regarding human rights defenders, I believe, at the moment. A couple of months ago, I presented to the UN General Assembly my latest report on the positive outcomes achieved when women are properly involved in peace negotiations. And I want to particularly note the submission I received in preparing the report from the Women's Policy Group Northern Ireland, which helped us a lot in thinking how to frame it. I know many of you here will have seen firsthand how involving women in negotiations can bring great benefits. This isn't a hunch or a feeling, not something based on a few anecdotes. As I told the General Assembly, the hard evidence shows that if you involve women meaningfully in peace negotiations, the process is more likely to succeed. The probability of a peace agreement lasting at least 2 years increases by 20% if you properly involve women, and the probability by 35% that it will last 15 years. Women human rights defenders working in conflict situations do extraordinary work. Some of them are documenting and monitoring violations against women, and others are pursuing justice and accountability. elements essential to any transitional justice process. In Iraq, women human rights defenders collected evidence of the crimes carried out by ISIS against the Yazidi community, and their persistent advocacy led to the Yazidi Female Survivors Law in Iraq in 2021, which recognized ISIS attacks against the Yazidi community as genocide and crimes against humanity, and provided for reparations and rehabilitation for survivors. And yesterday at the Paris platform, that young woman, Norad, a member of who won the Nobel Prize some years ago, she spoke. And, you know, I think she has the saddest, she was a victim of trafficking herself, and I think she has the saddest eyes of anyone I've ever seen in such a young person. It is crucial that women and LGBTI people remain involved in the public life during conflict, when their rights are often downgraded. We see too often how their rights are among those jettisoned early on in the compromises involved in peace deals. In many places, this work is often done in difficult and dangerous and post-conflict contexts, and all too often results in physical and sexual attacks, stigmatization, criminal charges, smear campaigns, threats, harassment and ill treatment. Too often and in too many places, states are failing in their obligation to protect these women human rights defenders who are helping to build sustainable peace. States have to realise that if you want women human rights defenders involved in contributing to peace, and they should, then they had better protect them. There are useful things that states could do now all over the world to help protect human rights defenders. And they don't cost money. They can condemn frequently and publicly attacks on defenders and celebrate their work as legitimate and essential to contributing to the rule of law and to just, sustainable and lasting peace. They can commit to opening prompt, effective, efficient, transparent and independent investigations into attacks on human rights defenders. They can stop using language that stigmatizes, abuses, disparages and discriminates against them. They can invite them to speak in places like this. And if governments, national or local, need more ideas on what to do to better protect human rights defenders, they can ask them. Listen to their advice on how they want you to protect and support them in their work. It's up to those in authority, as I said before, to find the political will to make these things happen. And, you know, protecting human rights defenders is not rocket science, and sometimes it takes so little to protect them and empower them to do their work in really building civil and just societies. I often think repression is a measure of effectiveness when it comes to human rights defenders. There's a lot to be despondent about. I speak to human rights defenders every week that are under pressure, severe pressure, and often they are in severe danger, and often they are very desperate. And these past few weeks I've been hearing from human rights defenders in Sudan, in Tigray, in Gaza. And I've joined with other rapporteurs calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and criticising the failure of the international system to mobilise to prevent genocide. States must act, but so too must business. There must be an end to arms sales and an end to the occupation, and some form of political renewal and some form of international peacekeeping or monitoring force to implement a ceasefire. What is happening is a catastrophe of enormous proportions, and I understand the huge feelings of trauma that people feel about this. But we can't afford to despair and to give up and to abandon those who are asking us to do what whatever we can. What we can do might not be much, but we must try. And so for myself, I'm speaking to human rights defenders in Israel and in Palestine, in Gaza and the West Bank, listening to them, asking them what do they want to do, want us to do for them. But it's not easy because, once again, the key ingredient, as we've all seen, political will, is lacking. And in these really difficult times, I get encouragement from the perseverance of human rights defenders all over the world, and particularly children and young people who are human rights defenders. Earlier this year, we brought 40 young people, well, 30 young people and 10 children to Vienna, young human rights defenders, and heard about their realities. A lot of them were in danger, and also their plans for the future. And my next report, I decided then, was going to be on children and young people who are human rights defenders, many of whom weren't even born when the declaration was adopted. And I've made children and young defenders a priority for me for part of the next term. I mean, for the next term, part of my priorities for the next term, because we need young people to carry the human rights movement into the future. And we hope that they'll do a better job of it than the rest of us did. But even when I was young, I used to say that too, you know, like, what kind of a world have you left to us? But I think it's the job of human rights defenders to hold the line on justice and truth and the rule of law, because without them, things would be far worse. And, you know, I started this work in the 70s, and I saw an awful lot of atrocities since I've started. But here, as much as anywhere, we know that we have come through dark times. We know that we'll get there. We know that we have to continue trying and to listen and to protect and promote the work of human rights defenders individually and internationally. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mary. We have some time. Mary has kindly agreed to take questions from the floor. And Ali and Alex are available too. So there's mics doing the round. Please don't be shy. Put your hand up and the mic will find its way to you. Any questions?
Hi, Mary. Thanks for your work over the years and for your talk. My name's Declan Owens. I'm the International Secretary for the Socialist Lawyers Association of Ireland. And I just wondered if you could give us an update on the 6 Palestinian human rights organisations that were declared terrorist organisations under the Israeli 2016 law, and if you could maybe just have a word about trade unions as human rights defenders as well. Thanks.
Austria and Switzerland have said they're not terrorists and have restored their funding. The EU has restored its funding. It did that a little while ago. But there are still a couple of states, like Denmark, and I'm not sure who the other one is, that are doing this kind of looking at them to see whether or not money has gone to Hamas. Now, the thing is, like with the Swiss government, who have restored the funding, they had actually done their analysis of the organisations just about a month before. So it was, to me, it was very strange. But so that's the up-to-date position at the moment. Trade unionists who are human rights defenders, of course. In Algeria, for example, I met with many trade unionists who are trying to work for just normal trade union activities, working for the rights of the employers, you know, fair wages, fair conditions, that kind of thing. All of them are being criminalised for that. And we see it around the world where trade unions, labour rights activists, you look at China, for example. I did a report on long-term imprisonment because I think it's one of the cruelest abuses there is. And I did it on people defenders who had been who were serving sentences of 10 years up to life, because I wanted to show what a big problem it was. And I wrote to 24 states, 148 human rights defenders. And to me, you know, after the first flurry of activity, you know, they fade from the sight as they fade from the mind. And among them were labour rights activists. So it's an ongoing priority for me. And there were 3 in the UAE last year whose sentence was up, 3 human rights defenders, one of them a friend of mine, human rights lawyer, and they weren't released, and they're still imprisoned. They haven't yet been given new sentences, but they're just keeping them here and there. Sorry.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, can you hear? Hello, I'm Shannon, I'm from Axone. I don't know if this would be directly relevant for yourself, Mary, but thank you for all the work that you're doing. I think we're very lucky to have somebody like yourself that's doing so much for so many people. This is a wee bit of a specific question for what's happening here in relation to asylum seekers. So actually on our way here, we received a call about a completely unrelated matter about the attacks that are happening at the hotel in Bangor. So there's protests every week. Just recently it's been attacked again with like paint and stuff. But we were speaking with the police about this, and just in passing conversation, they had mentioned that this policy called Operation Maximisation is about to be rolled out here this week. So basically that means if you are a single male in a hotel seeking asylum, that there is a potential now that you could be bundled up with up to 4 other people in the rooms. So obviously that's a major injury to somebody's sense of privacy, somebody's sense of dignity. So I'm just wondering, has anybody else in the room heard about this? Because as far as I was aware, we were reassured by MERS that this wasn't going to be rolled out, but we've just got confirmation that this is about to start this week. So is there anything we can do as members of the human rights community, as members of civic society and people who support the most vulnerable people in our society? What can we do to roll this back? Thank you.
Well, as you say, the issue of asylum seekers, refugees and migrants is not my mandate. There is a special rapporteur on that, so you could make a complaint to him and see if he would write to the government. You go onto the OHCHR website and fill in whatever, I don't know the email address, but you could do that. But my first report, I actually went to Greece on my first country visit because I wanted to look at the situation of defenders of refugees, migrants and asylum seekers coming over from Turkey and that, because it was so shocking to me. I'd had online meetings and lawyers were being criminalised for just trying to give them legal support. Search and rescue, where we're being slapped. Search and rescue defenders were being slapped with all sorts of charges, and they were terrible charges. It wasn't just aiding and abetting legal entry. It was money laundering. It was spying, and you know, and this was going on. I met so many of them. So what I would advise you to do is maybe get in touch with some of the other organisations, and I can talk to you after, or get your email and refer you to some of the organisations that have been working on the issue in Greece. They've built up so much experience, and you could maybe talk to some of them. But over to the floor, because you probably have more experience.
Can I suggest, Alyson may not want to comment on this, maybe approach us just after the event and we'll put you in contact with staff or Alyson himself and we'll have a chat. Thanks.
I'm Paul Yam, previous commissioner. I've mentioned that this a year ago. It's about racist hate crime in Northern Ireland. I mean, after 25 years, Good Friday Agreement, obviously the hate crime is remain high, and one of the solution is to have hate registration in Northern Ireland. That would actually increase the enforcement and conviction itself, and also give confidence for the community as well, especially the minority. And we don't have the assembly here, and obviously, if that's not going to happen next few days or next year, in personal view, I think that we should approach Secretary of State and get it through to the House of Commons. And I just basically want to ask that what is your view, concern about our lobbying for this hate registration to be in place in Northern Ireland?
I don't know enough about the legislation, but I would encourage everyone to work against racism and to use every channel that you have and mobilise together against racism. And again, there's a rapporteur on racism at the UN, a special rapporteur on racism. You could look up his details and make a complaint to him. But maybe Alyson would be better.
Yeah, I think we'd agree with you that legislation would be beneficial. But in the meantime, there is still a lot that can be done if people just do the job properly that they've been assigned to do. So policing, prosecutorial decision-making in schools. All of this can be tackled without law, but law would be the ultimate aim. So we would support you in that.
Thank you. Another question here.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Yeah? Okay, great. Good afternoon. My name is Ciara Campbell. I'm here from the DFA. So thank you for being here, Mary, and congratulations on the landmark year. As you referenced in your speech, this year you presented a report on 25 years of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. So I would be grateful if you could expand more on how you engage with states and their response when you presented your report to the NIHRC this year. Thank you.
Well, I had great time at the UNHCR this year because they set themselves up, a lot of them. You see, the great thing about presenting a report to the Human Rights Council is you have your remarks, you get 7 minutes and you say them. And then they open up to states for what they call the interactive dialogue. So states get 2 minutes each. Well, they got 2 minutes because all of them wanted to speak for me, to ask questions or to make comments. And so many of them just came out and said, you know, things like they support the work of the Special Rapporteur and what more can they do. This, if I hear this again, I think I'll commit harry-carry. What more can we do to protect human rights defenders? And this was coming from states like, you know, Iran, UAE, where my 3 friends are imprisoned. You know, and the poor young woman from Iran talked about, you know, protecting human rights defenders and or not protecting human rights defenders having been perfectly fine in Iran. I just said to her, I don't know how you can stand up and say that. And when you've seen what has happened in Iran for the last year and a half with all those young people and young women particularly. And so I was able to have a good old cut and thrust with all the states that are really abusive to human rights defenders. When I go to them individually, the reception is it's always polite, apart from some states, which I won't name, who are really hostile and who roar at me. But usually it is polite, and they listen to you, and they try and persuade you that whoever it is a terrorist or a political subversive or a something or other. And I just say to them, look, I know the difference between a terrorist and a human rights defender, and I know the difference between a political activist and a human rights defender. And, you know, I kind of draw myself up with my as much authority as I can muster. We do get some results. I mean, I remember the Egyptian ambassador ringing me about a case I'd taken up to tell me they were going to be released the next day. which was fantastic. We have had, social media is amazing. Of course, I'm a dinosaur, I don't do it. But one of my young team does it for me. But we started to use social media because the UN system is really slow and really ponderous and really bureaucratic. So when you can't be hanging around when human rights defenders are in danger, you have to act like that. So one of the ways that I can act is to put it on Twitter fast. And I realized after a while when the president of Honduras replied to a tweet I sent about a defender, and the defender was released. And then in some Philippines, I think it was, they were debating a law which was going to restrict the ability of human rights defenders to do their work. And some senator quoted it in the parliament, so it was postponed. And I realized that you can use Twitter as an advocacy tool. I never thought of it as anything except just putting it out there. So now we use it a lot as an advocacy tool. And, you know, even yesterday we had some good news. I mean, the thing is, you know, when you're working in human rights, as you all know who work in human rights, you know, you just need small victories to keep you going. And when you get the little small victories, it gives you enough firepower and air to continue for the next while. And that's what, you know, I always think human rights defenders are caught between madness and hope, you know, because they do mad things. I mean, they put themselves in danger for the rights of others, not for themselves. And they continue to hope, they continue to persist, and they continue to resist. So when I speak to states, and yesterday the French said to me, well, we always like inviting you because you say it like it is and you remind us rather than pussyfooting around. So I get great joy out of telling states what I think of them, but also in a respectful way where I try and encourage them to know the difference between a terrorist and a human rights defender, because they in some cases, in some countries, you know, where there is authoritarian regimes, anyone who is against a state is a subversive or a terrorist. So I'm trying to educate them to show the legitimate human rights work done by human rights defenders in accordance with the declaration that they have all agreed to. So, you know, it's up and down. And to be honest, you know, I'd really, if I had my way, I would, well, I better not say what I do to them. But I just think states, the thing that gets me is there's no such thing as a good government. I really believe this because all governments are driven by their political and strategic interests. They never take a consistent view right across the spectrum, looking at an individual, looking at the case and seeing whether or not they're acting in a way that is in accordance with international standards. I mean, if it's something that is political to them, or it's a political or strategic interest on the way that they operate, they just don't. So I actually have very little respect for governments. I have a lot of respect for individuals in governments that are trying really hard, but as a breed, I have very little respect for governments.
Another question at the back.
Hello, Mary. I commend you. I'm the Reverend Paul Burns of Dublin Christian Ministries Ireland for the great work that you carry out. One of the things we work with are the vulnerable families, but I have found a very big problem in human rights in one particular area, which affects the working class, and that is the ability to get justice in employment tribunals. The companies in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland have the best of barristers and they have the best of lawyer teams. When I tried to take a case for one young woman that was actually had to leave, she was reduced to crying in front of her colleagues in a particular place of employment. There is no basis of funding. This is, when you go to take someone to try and get them a lawyer, they need to have funding up front. The companies already start with the finances and the best of barristers. When I spoke to an independent barrister, they said it really is a human right issue that the United Kingdom does not give a fair balance in the scales for the working class, particularly when it's very hard and there are families behind these mothers and fathers, and they are relying upon them to put food on the table, and they can be treated anyway and then just disposed of and not able to take their case after the 2-year period if they've been in employment for 2 years. So maybe it's a system that maybe the international human rights bodies can look at for the working class people in relation to employment issues in Northern Ireland as a whole.
Yeah, there's another special rapporteur on poverty, Olivier de Schutter. He's really good. And again, you could go on to his website. He has a website, and he works right across, all issues to do with poverty. My next report into the General Assembly next year is going to be on human rights defenders and the SDGs, because I want to show that human rights defenders work for all rights: economic, social, cultural, civil and political. So it can be health, it can be, education, it can be anything. And we've been collecting cases of human rights defenders who are in danger for their work on any one of the SDGs over the last while. But I'm afraid I can't. I don't know whether you want to say anything.
Yeah, the Commission has certainly looked at the issue of right of access to courts and right of access to lawyers. And what you're really talking about there is the right to legal aid, for legal assistance to be paid for. There isn't a short answer to that, which I can give you, which is going to be very satisfactory today. But it is something that we're looking at. And it's something I think we can bring back to the Legal Services Commission.
Thank you.
I work with the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People. So I'm delighted to hear that you are going to be having a special focus on child and young people human rights defenders, Mary. And I'm particularly interested in access to justice, child-friendly access to justice mechanisms, which is something that's consistently picked up by child and young people human rights defenders. We saw in the complaint to the UN by the group of young people that because they hadn't gone through their own complaint systems in their own countries, that wasn't upheld. But quite often that is a barrier. And I suppose, Alex, as well, I would like to know, is there any way that you can implement the Child Human Rights Defender Implementation Guide to encourage child-friendly access to justice?
Well, I mean, as Ali made the point a few minutes ago, and another question there, that obviously some of these things are available. There certainly are issues, and they're well understood. And what you really have to do here is just make sure that where there is a law, and where, for example, this Assembly, sometimes the Assembly doesn't have, particularly on immigration issues and stuff like that, doesn't have any mandate over that. That's all the Home Office in London. But there are some things which are responsibility of the Assembly here. So it's really important that we get the Assembly back up and running again. I know this seems to be a bit of a mantra, but it is true. The sooner we get this thing back up and running again, then that way people are able to go directly to the parties who the ministers come from to try to make sure that any future upcoming executive obviously does its work and implements these things where they have the power to do so. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. So people need to get their lobbying pencils sharpened. So as soon as the institutions are back up and running again, as I said earlier on, there's a big in-tray there. One of the things that's frustrated the life out of me, being in this role the last couple of years, since we've had the collapse of the executive, is a lack of accountability. Now, even before the executive collapsed, I would have been very concerned about accountability and the lack of it across the board here, from every department, and any element of society here to me is very, very unaccountable. That's the way I can put that. But the institution's been established means that at least you have a forum and a platform, and people who have their hands on the responsibility tiller, then you can go directly to them. So what I would say is that you will find that most of the parties, if not all of them, will be sympathetic to your point and to your arguments there. But it's about making sure you have a strong enough lobby and advocacy groups and champions for those issues to make sure that not only are people empathetic with you and understand and share your concerns, but they're going to do something frigging well about it. Simple as that. So I'm actually making an appeal here to people here today, even though I'm supposed to stay out of all of this stuff and being impartial. I will be impartial if there's any discussions on it. Of course, I'll do my job professionally. But you do need to make sure that the rights and protections which are there for people, particularly young people who need our support because they can't do it really themselves, because they're obviously too young and all that stuff. So they need us as their advocates and as their champions. So what I'll be urging people here, get ready for the Assembly and Executive, be up and running again, get your shopping list out and get at all of the parties to make sure they deliver on the protections, particularly of our young people and more vulnerable people in our society.
If we could just, we can also incorporate the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which might go some way. That could either be done UK-wide or it could be done here by devolved administration, like in Scotland. We'd have a look at that.
So there's an organisation in Geneva called Child Rights Connect, and oh, you know it. So you have the toolbox then, have you? Okay, so just to reinforce what you were saying about lack of access, what came out of the meeting in Vienna I had with the young people and the children were well, first of all, they wanted protection, but that was physical protection from, like there was a 13-year-old who was getting death threats because of his work on the environment in Colombia. So there was that kind of thing. But then it was all about participation and being listened to. You know, young people feel that too many people are taking decisions on their behalf. And they're working on issues like bullying, like the environment, like rights of women, and they, the children were working on mainly the environment and mainly bullying in schools. The ones that I met, and they were, you know, in some countries they're downgraded. They don't, if they're told if they continue to have manifestations, because they're not allowed to have demonstrations, if they continue to have manifestations about something or other, their grades are downgraded, you know, this sort of thing. They also, they were also telling, like one parent said to one young person, if you end up in the police station, don't expect me to come and get you out. You know, they don't feel support when they are working on issues of justice. And they don't feel, and they think there's ageism in the non-governmental organisation sector, where it's all run by old people like me, or well, I've actually gone beyond that. I'm oldie old, but you know what I mean. But they feel that they are being kept down, and they should be allowed participate more, have access to justice and access to funding and access to decision making.
There's another question at the back.
Hello. Hi. First of all, thank you so much, Mary, and to the Commission for hosting this event. It has all been really interesting and fabulous. My name's Alyson. I am a research officer at the Human Rights Consortium. And I guess I was interested in the things that you were saying, both about human rights defenders, but also about the kind of LGBTI rights in Ireland and kind of across the world. Earlier this year, I believe, we had the UN Special Rapporteur on sexual orientation and gender identity over in Belfast, who made a number of kind of raised a number of specific issues with the UK government with regards to how LGBTI human rights defenders were being treated in the UK, and with regards to the LGBTI community more broadly, how they are being treated. I guess I'm interested in kind of hearing your perspective on internally within kind of UN processes, how do, for instance, the Special Rapporteur on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity and yourself, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, how do you work together? How can maybe UN structures adapt and change in order to enable further kind of cross-working and collaboration?
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Victor, was it Victor? Yeah. Everybody loves Victor. But anyway, Victor and myself did some video on Twitter. I don't know if you saw them, but we did a joint campaign on LGBTI defenders. And then when there are communications, because I'm defenders, I can only do defenders. I can't do the wider issue of LGBTI rights. But whenever I would do a communication to a government about a specific group of LGBTI defenders or a specific LGBTI defenders, Victor would always jointly sign. The way the rapporteur system, we're all independent. You know, we're appointed by the Human Rights Council. You have to. You go through, you have an interview with an ambassador from each of the 5 regions, and then 3 names go to the UN, and then the president of the council floats the 3 names around the various regional groups, and then 1 person is picked. So that's how the process starts. But we're independent of the UN system. So it means that, and everyone is voluntary, and you only have 1 human rights officer working for you, and you also, in my case, I have an intern because I set up an internship when I was in Frontline donkeys years ago. But I'm also a good fundraiser, so I've fundraised money to have some external people working. So LGBTI defenders are a priority for me, along with women human rights defenders. So when I'm taking up cases, because I get hundreds of cases, a month. So what I do is I take up. I mean, if you're just getting a bit of low-level harassment, you won't make it. But if you're an LGBTI defender, if you're a woman human rights defender, if somebody has been killed, or if you're being given a long-term prison sentence, or a defender with disabilities, or somebody involved in business and human rights, which is either usually physical attacks or killing, they're kind of, and now young people and children, they're the cases I'll always take up. And then there are other rapporteurs. So, for example, if it's an issue of a defender, like, for example, in Algeria, where I was, people being criminalised because they expressed their opinions contrary, they criticised the government. I would write on their, I would do this form. This is the main tool. You write a formal letter to the government concerned, and you set out your concerns and you ask them questions, and they get 60 days to respond, unless you're able to do a press release. But in Geneva, you can only do a press release about 1 out of every 6, because they don't have enough capacity. So, and then any of the other rapporteurs, it goes on this internal database, which I don't have access to, and any of the other rapporteurs who might have an interest, or that you have specified. For example, we all have signed up to Gaza, everybody. We've all signed up to a statement yesterday on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But if it's an issue of sexual orientation or gender identity, and freedom of expression, then I would get the rapporteur on the SOGI rapporteur, and Irene Khan, who's the rapporteur on freedom of expression. So you pick your rapporteurs, but the more you pick, the longer the system takes. So I don't really favour picking. I don't really favour this. Having lots of rapporteurs sign up. But then I would refer people. I would refer cases that I have that I don't think fit my mandate to another mandate. And sometimes we even draft the communication because I have more staff. So I say, if we draft it, will you send it in your name? Because it fits your mandate better. So that's kind of the way we cooperate. It's a very informal basis. We have a meeting every year, to discuss lots of issues, whatever anyone wants to talk about, for a week. But it's really quite informal, and my alliances are usually the people who most match my priorities. So apart from the Special Rapporteur, the SOGI rapporteur, there's a rapporteur on freedom of expression, there's a rapporteur on freedom of association and assembly, there's violence against women, there's the working group on business and human rights. There's about 50 different rapporteurs. But I tend to have a core group of about 10 that I would pick and choose depending on the case.
Can I just add a very quick word to Alexa's question? I'm going to start with something a bit corny. So it's going to sound corny. I don't mean it to be corny. LGBTI rights are simply human rights. So we should all be defending those rights. But until that is the case, until that's the reality of it, then I think we've all got to get behind the LGBTI human rights defenders. And more, I think all of us in this room need to do more to do that. So if you'd like to bring some of the issues to us, the Commission's certainly very interested in hearing about them. But it's a really important point. But you shouldn't need to have your own defenders when there are so many of us in this room, but you still do. So we should be uniting behind those defenders.
At the risk of becoming very undisciplined, I'm going to allow one more question. If there's another pressing one, we'll maybe try and take two together, and then we're going to have to call it a day, unfortunately. And there's one online. So
thank you, David. Thank you, Mary, Alyson, and the Honourable Speaker. My question is directed to Mary and to Alyson. Since the 7th of October, we've seen 86 journalists die in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And my question is predicated on a statement that I hope everyone will agree with me, that the right to information is a human right. We've seen in the last 2 years the guardians of the international rules-based order basically imprisoning or cutting off access to information through human rights defenders in the form of journalists. And my question to you is, what is the position of the United Nations and the NIHRC with regards to Julian Assange? Thank you.
thank you. Jason, could we have the question online?
Yeah, it's just how can we support human rights defenders here in Northern Ireland through the Commission and civil society?
Ricky, Alyson and Mary, thank you so much. Really enjoyed all you had to say. I work here in the Assembly and have just been looking at disorder in parliaments recently. And of course, there have been so many attacks on parliaments that, you know, they're harder to get at, but we want them to be very transparent and accessible. And there's been a lot more environmental protest and manifestation in particular. And some of the neighbouring parliaments have had issues where, you know, paint has been thrown. So I was just wondering, is there anything you can refer us to in terms of good practice guidance to calibrate arrangements so that the freedom of expression is balanced appropriately? Thanks.
Thank you. So 3 questions. Julian Assange, role of the Commission on Civil Society, and Parliament's at the back. Who would like to go first?
Everyone's staring at me. Okay. Well, the point about journalism, freedom of expression is secured through journalism largely. So any attack on journalistic freedom or journalists' right to express themselves and for us to receive their opinions is fundamental and will undermine human rights. I do not have a position on Julian Assange. The Commission doesn't have a position in relation to Julian Assange, certainly not one that I could share officially as the Commission. So you'll have to allow me to simply say we don't have a position in relation to that, but you'll understand what I'm saying about journalism generally. In terms of understanding human rights, defending human rights defenders, one of the things I think is really essential to do is to change the narrative around human rights and around human rights defenders, because there is an awful lot of misinformation, disinformation out there about what human rights do, what human rights defenders do, and how dangerous human rights defenders can be and how anti-democratic they can be. So we really need to change the narrative continuously, getting the message home about what human rights are and how positive they are. In terms of balancing freedom of expression, that's really, I think, that's one of the great challenges for today, isn't it? You need to be able to say whatever you like to say, but freedom of expression, the strength of it is to be used against government, not against each other, to insult each other. And I think this is where it sometimes gets confused. Freedom of expression is a really important right because it allows you to stand up to those in power and say what you need to say against those in power. We sometimes translate the debate about freedom of expression into my right to call somebody or insult somebody, call them a name. That's not what freedom of expression is about. And you also aren't free to express hate or intolerance or threaten somebody. So it is a balancing exercise. And I think if you're too strict about the rules, you get it wrong. So each one really has its own context and circumstances. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but human rights, there's rarely a black and white answer. I think that's actually the beauty of them because they're very context specific and they allow you to allow for individual differences.
Mary, would you?
I'm just looking up what I said about Julian Assange. I don't consider him a human rights defender. It's more of a freedom of expression issue. And for me, the reason I decided not to take him up, we looked very carefully into the case. So I'll just read you out, it's easier. It was not clear that WikiLeaks in its original form was motivated by human rights. Some of its supporters framed their motivation in human rights terms, but Assange at the time was more an anti-privacy absolutionist, and my perspective was that he was as much motivated by fame, notoriety, than any benefit to others, unlike, for example, the case of Chelsea Manning. And the way that WikiLeaks made information public, this is my real concern, with no regard to the safety of many individuals affected, was not consistent with the human rights-based approach. That was really why I decided. I have this motto where I say, when in doubt, leave them out. And it was because there were a lot of human rights defenders mentioned in WikiLeaks who could have suffered severe repercussions by being named. And I don't think that it should have been done in that way. So I didn't take him up as a human rights defender.
Thank you, Mary. Colleagues, we're going to have to end there. We've gone over a little time. I know there's lots of other people I saw wanted questions in the room, so please feel free to approach at the end and we'll try and have a chat. You heard it here first, Alex suggesting that everyone get their wish list together. So as we head to Christmas, I would suggest you would do worse than start here for your Christmas wish list. Have a look at the Commission's report. The actual hard copies are like gold dust, but it's available online to download. And to Mary, I think in terms of just the breadth of the questions and the variety that we've seen this afternoon is tantamount to the really difficult job that Mary's tasked with in terms of as a UN Special Rapporteur and the breadth of her mandate. So if you could please show our appreciation for Mary and her wonderful speech.